Afternoon, everyone. We're going to give people an opportunity to join in and we'll get started shortly. My name is Deborah Levine, and I am your Community Engagement Officer for the City University, the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. Welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time today for this very important conversation. Breaking Barriers Through Leadership with Leading with Justice, Part 2. We have an exciting panel today, and we're super excited to continue this conversation about reentry, about what it means to be engaged in expungement, what it means for us in terms of cannabis and next steps around academics, around workforce development. And we have two experts with us today who will lead us in this conversation. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Today, just also want to acknowledge our partners, Community Board 9, Community Board 10, JUSTÜS Foundation, the Youth Connect, and Manhattan EOC. So thank you to our partners for joining us and supporting us in this conversation. Today's speakers will include Dr. Danielle Green, the Executive Director of the State and Local Health Initiatives, along with Anthony Watson, the Executive Director of the SUNY Manhattan Educational Opportunity Center. Next slide. So we have a panel as always. So if you would please take a few minutes to just answer these 4 questions. We'd like to know from you about the length of webinars and what works for you, whether it's 60 minutes or 90 and how that happens. You'll also see as you're filling out the questions that we are using the Q&A feature today. So if there is a question that you would like to ask one of the panelists or something that you would like us to connect to or answer, please feel free to put your question in the Q&A, and you'll see that it is located at the bottom of your screen. And so if you move your indicator over there, you'll see where it says Q&A. If you don't see the Q&A button, please select more. That option should give you a little pop-up where the menu will come up and you just click Q&A. You type your question in the box, and then you can choose to submit it anonymously or by your name. And only the presenters and the hosts will see your question until it's answered. If we don't get to all the questions today, we will do our best to make sure that we try to answer them when we send out this recording, along with the contact information and any slides that are attached to this presentation today. Next slide. So again, today is our fireside chat, and we are super excited to be able to have a conversation both with Dr. Danielle Green and Anthony Watson. After the presentation and the chat, we'll open for Q&A and then some quick takeaways. Next slide. So please, again, if you have a few minutes, please make sure if you can't see the poll, let us know and we'll be happy to reshare it with you. But it's really important that we have a sense of how this information is coming to you and also how we can do better on our future webinar series. So we will get started because we want to make sure that we give our guests ample time to really be able to immerse themselves in this conversation. And so I will be introducing this morning Dr. Danielle Green, who has been a colleague, a friend, and a mentor for many years, and super excited to be able to work with her at the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. Dr. Green is our Executive Director of the State and Local Public Health Initiatives at the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. She has over 20 years of public health leadership experience, both in local and state government, academic, and non-for-profit settings. Most recently, Dr. Green has joined us from the New York State Department of Health, where she was the Chief of Staff to the Commissioner and played an integral part in the New York State's COVID-19 response. Previously, Dr. Green has held several senior positions in Healthy Homes projects at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and at the Center for Applied Public Health at Columbia University as an adjunct professor at the New York School of Global Health. In these positions, Dr. Green has coordinated with community, faith communities, academic institutions, government partners to address the opioid pandemic, aging, long-term care, maternal child health and morbidity, AIDS, lead poisoning, asthma, through a lens of equity and social justice, and looking at social determinants of health. So, Dr. Green, Danielle, it is a pleasure, as always, to have you join us and be able to lead us in this conversation. And thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, Deborah, for that very generous introduction. And I'm honored to have been a collaborator and partner with you for so many years. And you mentor me too. It's a wonderful relationship. I'm also honored to be asked to speak here today and really excited to get to the part where I have a conversation with Anthony Watson, who has done amazing work himself in developing educational and employment opportunities. Today, we want to talk about restorative justice and cannabis. And when I think about restorative justice, I'm reminded of the key principles, which are to repair the harm that's been done with a focus on responsibility, reintegration, and reparation. And often when we think about cannabis and restorative justice, we tend to think about individuals, especially those who were disproportionately affected by law enforcement practices during cannabis prohibition. And many of the remedies focus on how people who have been affected this way, particularly Black and Brown people, people from disadvantaged communities, can obtain licenses to be a part of the business aspects of cannabis. And there's been a lot of investment in cannabis workforce development that's really focusing on how to run or be a part of a dispensary, how to process and cultivate cannabis, and how to build your entrepreneurial skills. In the New York State Office of Cannabis Management, or OCM's most recent report on the new legal cannabis market, they talked a lot about jobs and economic opportunities in agriculture and agribusiness, tourism, craft cannabis, think similar to like small wineries, craft beer, and advanced manufacturing like packaging, storaging, labeling, warehouse and distribution logistics, and even brownfield revitalization. And while all of these are really important economic pathways that may now be available through the legalization of cannabis, as a public health practitioner, public health is supposed to look at the impact across broad groups of people. And we usually do this looking at demographics or geography or occupations or other characteristics, but we look at communities, not just individuals. So as I prepared for today, I started thinking about what restorative justice would look like for communities when it comes to cannabis and what else we need to be doing. So what are the things communities might need to know when deciding whether to allow adult use recreational cannabis or medical cannabis in their areas and neighborhoods? How are they going to decide what the right number of dispensaries or shops is? Where are the models or history they should be looking at? What employment opportunities could exist when you look at it from that perspective beyond the things OCM mentions in their report? And how are we going to prepare ourselves, our emerging leaders, and our communities to take advantage of this and to be ready? And honestly, right now we're at a pivotal and exciting but very confusing moment when it comes to cannabis. Adult use and medical cannabis are legal in many states, but the choice of how to do this and whether to do this can be made by cities, counties, or even community boards. And cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, which affects many local governments' attitudes towards cannabis and makes some industries, such as banking and other financial parts of the financial sector, unable or unwilling to engage with cannabis businesses. At the same time, the White House has put forth that it's considering changing the designation of cannabis from the most restrictive classification, Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This could open up the ability to conduct new research, including clinical trials, and community-based participatory research, and it could even change banking and interstate commerce laws. So then, in the midst of all this change and uncertainty, and multiple levels of decision makers having different opinions, what is the training we need? What can academia do to help prepare as researchers, thought leaders, policy advisors, and educators of a new generation of leaders and practitioners? How do we identify the new career opportunities and help those careers emerge? What fields or models should we be looking at so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past or reinvent the wheel? Because we can implement the lessons learned from other public health situations up front if we pay attention. So here are the questions I would like to see us think about. What is the research we want to conduct? Who should be conducting that research and where? What data do we need? Is there a role for peer counselors within the cannabis industry or the health aspects of cannabis? Would peer counselors help people understand benefits and dangers, decide what kind of cannabis to use, when and how often? Should there be cannabis use lounges and safe places to indulge in cannabis? Is this a good or a bad idea? Do human resources policies at different types of occupations and industries and businesses need to be updated to address legal cannabis use? Does cannabis have a role in employee wellness programs? What do social workers, hospitals, medical providers, child protective services, legal services, and others need to understand about cannabis in order to make sure their policies are up to date and not punitive, but still protective? What should occupational safety workers know about cannabis or building inspectors? Cannabis is not like alcohol or opioids, but we can learn from the related programs and policies. We know prohibition didn't work well for alcohol, but we also have concerns about the proliferation of alcohol retail businesses in communities. There are years of science on the benefits and harms of alcohol, but we still don't message it well. What is the role of advertising and entertainment in alcohol sales and use? What can we do differently for cannabis? Should there be cannabis consultants in the entertainment industry? Should urban planners use data and mapping to create formulas for cannabis density? What skills do we need to teach people to do this work? What even do we know ourselves about cannabis? How many of you know that cannabis dispensaries sell many different forms of cannabis other than flower to smoke? Why does it matter? Well, different formations have different effects. And also, there can be different potencies. But we need to balance everything we know with what we know about health as well. We've known for a long time that inhalation or smoking has a negative impact on your health, regardless of what you are smoking. New York City's groundbreaking smoke-free policies have reduced tobacco smoking and improved health for millions of residents. But do people realize that while selling and smoking cannabis may be legal, if you live in smoke-free housing, that applies to cannabis too? Who is looking at the intersection of all these laws and policies and thinking about what the implementation means and how to educate people about them? So I've given you a lot of things to think about and ponder. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and new friend, Anthony, to tell you a bit about the work he's done, what MEOC does, and then we'll start digging into a dialogue about this. Anthony?
Thank you very much, Dr. Danielle Green. I will call you Danielle for purpose of this conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. As you may know, I'm not sure, Deborah, if you're going to introduce, or I should just kind of move through. As you may or may not know, I've been in the Harlem community for over 17 years, coming out of the work with Abyssinia Development Corporation, then becoming the executive director for this SUNY Manhattan Education Opportunity Center. And looking at kind of the intersections that Danielle has spoken about, I can't wait to really delve into more conversations and have real fireside chat around, you know, what the community is looking at. Next slide. So, you know, MEOC is created to provide workforce development as well as academic services. MEOC is one of 10 educational opportunity centers throughout the New York State area, really providing comprehensive programming for individuals who are looking to either re-enter the workforce or re-enter their educational opportunities. So we serve probably over 2,500 individuals in the Harlem community each year. We've been around for approximately 57 years. It was definitely derived out of kind of social justice movement in the 60s, looking at ways to really leverage opportunities for individuals who may not have had an opportunity to go into post-secondary education through the traditional space. So we were fortunate to have a number of leaders who really fought for this. We are legislated to exist, which means that each year we go through legislative approval, but we are codified in education law to exist, which is a huge, huge thing for the work that we do. We traditionally work with non-credit, non-traditional students that are not in the academic arena, but on that other space. So next slide. So a bit more about, you know, we're located, our mission, I kind of went through that already, so I'm not going to go through there. I want to get into more of kind of the programs that we offer, because I think it's important to this conversation that we're having about the types of programs that we offer. We are located in the Adam Clayton Power State Office Building. It's interesting that I'm in this building, and also at one point I worked for Abyssinian Development Corporation, so who was the Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, was the pastor of the church, and you know, so I didn't make this up. This wasn't a calling that I typically planned out, but it happened to work that way. So I am in the Adam Clayton office building, as well as we have some sites over at CUNY in the Heights, which is in Washington Heights community. Next slide. So eligibility, what I would say, instead of going through, you have to be a New York State resident in order to take some of our services. But instead of me going through all of this, what I'll do is I'll make sure that you have information in reference to who you should go to if you have people that you want to refer over. But the biggest thing is being a New York State resident in order to take part of this program. And also income, you have to be within a certain income bracket in order to do that. Next slide. So these are some of the programs that we offer. I'm going to go through it a little bit just so that you can get the breadth of what we do. So we offer a lot of allied health programs. We're still in the space where we're looking to expand even the offerings that we're providing. We go from certified electronic health records, medical assistant, EKG, phlebotomy, certified nursing. One of the cool things that we just started was our commercial driver license, CDL programming. So we're looking to work with a trucking company to actually provide individuals who are looking for these services or looking for jobs in this industry to get opportunities to do that. We also do security officer training, and that's going to be important to the cannabis work as we talk about kind of different career opportunities that come through kind of the work that Danielle was mentioning before. We also are in the space where we're working with English learners of different languages. Most recently, we started looking at working with asylum seekers and others. We prepare individuals for their high school diplomas, but we're also a high school testing site, which means that for those who are looking for their GEDs, we actually test. We're a testing site. We do over 1,000 testing each year, just in that alone. And then we prepare people for college. Some of the things that we also do additionally is our CANE labs, which is advanced technology training and information networking programming. And those are self-paced, kind of self-led labs that we oversee, where people can come in and do Rosetta Stones and some other Microsoft Office suites and things of that nature, just to get their training on themselves. Then we have a college connection project. I'm going through these other four intentionally only because these are services that are kind of widely used for the community. College Connection is a grant that we have through our trio with Department of Education, where we're actually doing financial aid for individuals who are looking to go to college. And we also provide financial support in order for them to do their application. So in that work, we serve 1,000 individuals as well. And then these two new projects that we have taken on, HSC Connect, in collaboration with the Institute through John Jay, we're actually doing an HSC program, high school diplomacy program for individuals who had had some involvement with the prison system. So this is a pretty cool one because it leads us to kind of broaden the type of work and be more intentional about what we're doing with those who were formerly incarcerated. And then this is another one that I'm pretty proud of, is the Youth Build program, which is working with individuals 17 to 24 who dropped out of school but looking for work in the construction trade, and partnering really strategically around that part of it. It had gone away for a little while in Central Harlem, and MEOC decided to go after the grant, and this is a Department of Labor grant to do that work. The one thing I also didn't mention is that all of our services at MEOC are free, so no one has to pay anything to participate in any of our programs. Next slide. And we'll leave this in the chat as reference to how do you go to us. It's what you'll find is that also very interesting, and I just want to go back a bit, not go back to the slide, but just kind of focus on the slide. You'll see that it says www.bmcd.cuny.edu. All of the EOCs, Educational Opportunity Centers throughout the New York State area, are tied to a post-secondary institution. So either a SUNY school or a CUNY school. Downstate EOCs are connected to the CUNY system. So that's why you'll see some of our websites and some of the things that have some of the CUNY institutions on it. So we are all connected to either CUNY or SUNY by way of an agreement between SUNY and CUNY. Students for this downstate are SUNY students, but CUNY staff. Don't want to complicate things. If you do have questions or information, we do have this website, and the person who's our enrollment coordinator, Richard Frias, will be more than happy to walk through what we do and how you can get students registered. So I think at this point, Danielle or Deborah, I'm complete with
That was great, Anthony. I don't know about our audience, but just listening to that, I already thought of 2 more projects I need to tap you about that I have in my portfolio. So,
I'm excited to do that. So
focusing on what Deborah told us to talk about today, um, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A as we start talking. This is our fireside chat portion. So based on the services that MEOC offers, what do you see as how we can prepare people wherever they are, whether they're coming back into a community or getting their GEDs or graduating high school, to people looking for professional training or in college or grad school? How can we start inserting preparation for some of the types of cannabis work we've been talking about? How do we start bringing that lens and perspective in?
great question, Danielle. I think one of the very interesting part is that I was part of providing a grant through one of our, partners, the CUNY, where we actually created a cannabis project where we looked at actually some of the areas that you mentioned, that manufacturing, dispensary, as well as security guard. We added security guard. I think we need to begin training, and then there was an entrepreneurship track to it. So we need to begin really training our individuals about what cannabis is and what it can do for the community, and also what are some of the opportunities that people can really delve into when it comes to these particular opportunities. I think as we're looking at this work, we also have to look at the medical piece of it, medical cannabis, right? Like a lot of the hospitals and entities are looking to ways of training individuals around this. I think that one of the things I would say is that we should really look at what we currently have. A lot of times we begin building things outside of what we're accustomed to doing. And we need to really look at, okay, what do we have as a fabric of what we do? What is our core kind of mission? And then begin to tailor some of the new opportunities to what we do, because then some of it is particularly may not be separate, right? When I think about security guard, now we're also trying to look at, prevailing wage opportunities, right? So I'm very mindful that we also want, when we do this, we want to put people in positions where they can actually succeed financially and self-sustain themselves. So, but when we look at programs that we offer, right? So how do we tie in the healthcare component? I mentioned EKG, I mentioned CNA, I mentioned some of these other opportunities. Like, where does cannabis and some of these entities fit into the training aspect of it? Because one of the things that we haven't done is, as you mentioned, we have different laws, right? So the federal government hasn't approved cannabis to be something that, we can do, but the state of New York has, right? But then even within our own state, there's still some conflict in reference to kind of where we go and how do we provide opportunities, especially to the businesses. But I think that we need to be very mindful that the training aspect is extremely important to this work, because we need to be able to train the workforce. It reminds me of when we, back in 2006, 2008, there was this whole thing about weatherization and green, and some of the outside states were very prepared because they had a lot of land to do it. But when we looked at New York City, green was a little different because it wasn't as prepared, right? Because we had an older infrastructure. I kind of look at that the same way, like that we know marijuana, cannabis has been around for a number of years. In my day, they used to call it marijuana or weed. Excuse me if I'm going in a different direction, but they used to call it marijuana or weed. Now we moved it to a more focused area of being politically correct, right? And calling it cannabis, so that we can get a broader range. But I do think that educating people on the types of opportunities that are there is beneficial. And, a lot of people are creating as they go. because people are really unfamiliar where it's going to go. Did that answer some of you?
Some of it, I think that you made some really good points. There is a lot of creating it as we go because it's so new. I think there's, and as you said, let's use the structures that are there. So for example, if we look at the nursing assistance training you provide, nursing assistant training, or the direct service trainings, can you start, I mean, med schools are barely talking about cannabis, but can you start talking about it in the nurse assistant program and letting people know, teaching them how to ask questions about cannabis use? How is it going to get recorded in the medical record? That this isn't necessarily an automatic referral to drug treatment because someone's admitted to you that they use cannabis, right? It's separating out the attitudes and the education people need, letting people know that they need to ask questions like, well, is this recreational or is this medical use? Why are you using this? What formulations are you using? What formula? Because all of that may actually matter for whatever health services someone is seeking, but it has to be a safe place to disclose that information so people know how to ask. They need to have the knowledge on what to do. And then, you're teaching people about electronic health records. Do we even have a place in the health record to write this down?
Correct. And to that point, a lot of times the employer kind of sways the way in which programs are developed, right? And I think that one of the things I try to do, or we try to do at MEOC, is we try to tailor some of the work that we're doing based on kind of what the employers want, but having a comprehensive conversation with the employers around this work. I think a lot of times in education, or just in the work that I do, we start creating things based on kind of research that we've done, and sometimes don't have the real conversations about how this program will impact and will there be real outcomes to the work that we're doing, right? Because I think as we're creating, there's the policy side, right? And then there's the other space about the active work that we have to do. The policy side may have very clear kind of guidelines and where we should go around cannabis, but when we get to the workforce and the training aspect of it, how does the policy really speak to what the field is doing? And I think, those conversations need to be very clear in order to come up with some of those things, because like a CNA, we could do the training, or in the healthcare field, we could do the training, but in certain entities, the employers will not accept someone with a potential criminal background that's related to drug use or marijuana, right? So, or cannabis. So we have to be mindful of the impact, and as well as, our community has been really impacted by cannabis, right? Not just from what you mentioned earlier, not just from a training aspect, but from a trust aspect. Like many of our communities, many of our people in our communities have gone to prison for marijuana or cannabis use, right? And now coming out, how do we make sure that they're part of the opportunities that may be availed in this situation? And it's a tricky situation, Danielle, because it's one of those things that is very personal, right? So when we talk about policy, we got to talk about the personal aspect. It's very personal to many people who have been totally impacted. So as we're creating these trainings, people are very mindful that not everyone may agree with them. And I think that's also important to understand as we're kind of pushing kind of what the direction is going to be around this, even with, talking about the Clean Slate Act and some of the other things that came up. So.
Right. No, because even with the Clean Slate Act, there are opportunities within the manufacturing and the dispensaries and the cultivation that people will be eligible for, but it may be harder to get these security guard jobs.
Right.
Or, as you mentioned, some that are in, healthcare institutions or other places, but are there jobs outside of, actually, Deborah likes to refer to them as the flower touching jobs. So beyond the flower touching jobs in the cannabis industry, what are the cannabis related jobs that people who are coming out and are benefiting from the Clean Slate Act could be eligible for, could get? Maybe they could be consultants helping to develop proper HR policies, because it's not as simple as, oh, if you use cannabis, it's necessarily an offense, right? And people who use medical cannabis actually can work and should be allowed. Other people can work too. So how, but people don't know enough about cannabis. Can some of the people who have been in this world for so long and have been penalized for it be advisors to companies on how to address these issues?
And I agree, totally agree. And I think one of the things that we have to look at is who are the key people that we should be connecting with around this particular work, right? And I think that sometimes we get saturated in New York, but there are other states like Chicago who have figured out certain things. And then we also have lessons learned from places like California who have rolled things out and kind of struggled in certain ways. So who are people that we should be reaching out to outside of New York to really look at how we do this the correct way? I do know that there are entities who have been doing it for a number of years, who should definitely be in conversations around this work. So, excuse me. So I think, to your point, how do we leverage that, right? Because I think educating people on the use, right? When you walk through our community, sometimes you see there's a misconception of what cannabis could potentially be, right? And I'm not taking one side or the other, but there's a misconception of, I hear people saying, I'm walking the street and people are smoking cannabis or smoking marijuana, and it doesn't make me feel comfortable, right? Or you have mental health issues that are occurring in our communities, in our neighborhoods, right? And who's addressing that? But we're pushing cannabis. And I think that we have to be educated on, okay, what are the purposes of cannabis? There's recreation, but there's also medical, right? So there's been some history to show that the medical side of cannabis can be very beneficial to individuals, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to consume it by smoking, right? So I do think that there's an area of education, but then at the same token, when you say in a community that you're going to put a dispensary in your neighborhood and you have all of these other things that are going on, you're like, whoa, why are you doing that? We already are dealing with so many other kind of issues or concerns, and now you're going to put this in my community. But there's different areas that I think about the economic aspect of it, like what can be a driving force behind economics of cannabis, but then at the same token, will the people who've been impacted by this be also able to benefit from it? So I think.
Does it mean that, yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
And what does it mean that all these smoke shops are opening now on every corner that are not licensed dispensaries, but are opening to sell cigarettes and hookahs and paraphernalia for smoking and advertising themselves as smoke shops, and then either illegally selling cannabis or assuming they will soon get their own license, and they may or may not be opened by people who are a part of the most affected groups who were supposed to get the first go at the legal dispensaries. And how do you factor that in both economically and socially? as well as from a health perspective. And, you know, one of the promises of OCM when the Legalization Act was passed was that entities would get all this tax money from the legal sale of cannabis. So then how are you making sure that that's happening and the communities are getting to reinvest that money where they most need the help, which may be mental health services or addressing some of those other concerns, and who's monitoring that and helping to make those decisions, and how can we create, you know, help people at all levels of education and all levels of employment be a part of those jobs to help people sort through that. And I think, you know, what you brought up, Anthony, is there really still is a lack of understanding about the difference between medical cannabis and adult use recreational cannabis from a dispensary, and what might be sold in a smoke shop and what might be sold on the street. And a lot of people probably don't even know that in the medical side, there's actually, you know, high CBD makeups, high THC makeups, one-to-one makeups. And most of you here probably know that THC is the part that makes you feel low. And CBD actually has more of the medical properties and healing properties, but so being aware of that too. And I think for a long time, people who believed that there was, you know, medical benefits to cannabis just smoked the cannabis they could get because that's what they could get. And people don't really know there's so many different options in whether you have a gummy or a lozenge or an ointment, right? And that's something that policies are going to have to address as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're 100% right, Danielle, in that that overview. I think that educating is going to be the key. I think that, you know, one of the things that I did when we tried to create the manufacturing security officer training was really embedding a lot of education on that aspect, and also really looking at where were the jobs, right? And what were happening. I mean, it's so interesting because I had an opportunity to visit a farm upstate. Well, it was a farm, now it's a cannabis farm, right? So some of these farms that have been losing lots of resources and having to close, you know, people are now turning some of that into farms, so cannabis farms. So it's interesting how there's a vision about what this can be throughout, and then what's actually happening, you know, in the city around this as well.
Right. I mean, it's been very hard for some of the cannabis farms and the agricultural aspect of this because the rollout of the legal dispensaries has been slower than expected. So the farms don't have anywhere to sell their product. So that's created, you know, a thing. At the same time, we can link this to other issues. I know that I mentioned the brownfield revitalization, but there's also lots of been a movement, you know, back to the weatherization and greening movement you mentioned about urban farming and vertical farming, right? We're going to build greenhousey buildings with multiple levels. There was even what, hydro something that people were talking about for one. So can we do some of that agricultural work in our, you know, highly dense urban area? And are we going to, and would that have a good effect on our environment, as well as create opportunities and career opportunities? I believe we are being told to take a look at the QAs if we're so inclined. People have generously put some questions in. So let's see, I will read these and see if we have any answers. What are the ways that public health research can advance these policies and programs? Are there specific metrics research should be tailored to?
So, so I would say that there is already research that's out there that has been created around this particular work. I just think that we need to be able to identify those people who are doing the work. I do know that, the work that Deborah is doing at SPH and Dr. Green is doing is something that's kind of crucial in reference to kind of leveraging the resources around this work. So I do think that um, having more conversations with experts who are kind of very specific in particular areas would be helpful in this type of law.
I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity for community and expert participation from a wide range of perspectives to be a part of the developing of the research and the ongoing conversations. I think that we need to allow that people are going to have different attitudes and experiences
Absolutely.
and develop programs and policies that can reflect that. And I think that will help us with formulating the questions, which can range from how are people learning about cannabis? How are people reacting to the changes in the law? How, now that people have options for different formulations, what are people picking? How are people storing cannabis in their home? When you have gummies, how are you going to store that carefully? We've all seen the posters about don't call medicine candy because all this medicine can look a lot like candy. Well, now you literally have cannabis looking like a childhood snack. What are the safety protocols? In terms of, I don't have specific metrics to recommend.
Yeah.
There might be others who've looked more at this.
And I was going to say, Danielle, just as I'm thinking about when we talk a little bit about metrics, right? So what are we kind of identifying? We talked a little bit about the difference between medical marijuana and recreation, right? So, I mean, that can also be a starting point, right? Like, how do we differentiate what's impacting the community immediately and what's a more long-term kind of solution? I think that we're getting into this work very short term, right? There are a lot of people who've been working on this for many, many years, and there's some that has been working on it for 2 to 3 years, right? So the dynamics are shifting a bit, and I think that as we look at the metrics, like looking at the two components, but I agree with you. Maybe others have ideas around metrics, but I do think that um, when I looked at the project that we did, I looked at the short term. Okay, what are some short term opportunities around employment, around manufacturing, security, and some of the other things? And then I look really long term. Okay, what is the medical cannabis piece going to look like, and who are we going to work with within the hospitals and some of those other areas who are going to be embedding this as more of a health initiative? Our health crisis is also similar to um, when we call a crisis, there was a call for mental health crisis, right? And there was these resources that were put in to make sure that people were prepared. And I think that, we have to measure those as well.
Absolutely. We have two questions I'm sort of going to bring together because they both have to do with preparing your existing workforce. So we have a question about how do I prepare my social service staff to be cannabis ready? And we have a question about how do community health workers create the proper language around how to talk about cannabis, how do they do this in a way that's culturally competent, that does not lean towards the automatic bias of cannabis harms. And I think I'm merging both of these because I think both get to the question of, how do you begin to train your staff and change your staff's attitude? You sort of begin with the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs with your own staff, I think, because you have to look at what you know and how you feel about cannabis, both individually and as an organization, and educate yourselves about the differences, about what the laws are, because we have been talking about these things. I mean, many people, grew up with DARE programs in their school or other drug education and came from a time when it was abstinence only drug education, right? Everything was bad. So how do you move towards what the possibilities are and learning to create neutral conversations so that people will talk to you about this and you can be aware of resources and make recommendations based on what people are doing. And I think it's like any other sort of organizational change that you have to go through within your organization. When you start, whether it's moving towards restorative justice or an anti-bias attitude in your organization, I think places are going to have to go through that for cannabis too. What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, I would agree. I think you definitely need to focus in on what your policies are at your particular institution. I think that going outside of what those policies are can be risque only because we're in a space where there's still so much uncertainty. I mean, the state has, lifted certain requirements, but I do think that just providing information to your team that's relevant to what's happening currently, organizations that have federal dollars may have to be a little bit more careful about how they introduce it because the federal government has not approved it. So you have to be very conscious of the fact that could be impacting not just you personally, but also funding opportunities, right? So as you're in this work, I think that really educating yourselves on the policies around this and what are the do's and don'ts is important. Yeah, maybe we should create a do's and don'ts list, right? What can we do and what shouldn't we do? I think is important because there are still so many questions around, how do we infuse it? I do think there's also this thing about, our organizations still drug testing, right? And if they're drug testing, that's a policy of theirs. If they have to drug test for certain things. Okay, well, cannabis is legal now, so now, why should I be drug tested? But there's policies that are in place within organizations that require that you still need to, follow these particular policies. And I'm not sure if they took cannabis off the list as a drug. I think it's still there. So I think we need to be very conscious of, the policies that set forth, even on the training aspect, as we talk about teaching our staff. We have to be very mindful that our staff are also sending students to these employment opportunities, and they may do drug testing. Although, cannabis has been passed in New York, there's still those policies with these employers who are saying, you have to go through this for whatever reason. Their policies are in place. Um, so I think to that question. Yeah.
No, it makes sense. And I think it's also important to remind people that just because it's legal doesn't
Correct.
mean you can be in a state of being affected
Correct.
by it 24/7. There is still the possibility of being impaired. And if, say, you are getting your commercial driving license, there is appropriate and inappropriate use, right? We still have to be practical and
Absolutely.
things like we would with anything else.
Absolutely.
I think
That's
we're
a
getting,
great point, Danielle. That's a great point.
yeah, public health.
We don't want, people on the road like that. Yeah, absolutely.
But your idea of do's and don'ts, I think, leads us to a really nice final question as we get near time. I think we're getting near time. How can universities like the School of Public Health and the Educational Center like yours come together to create pipelines for non-traditional students who will benefit from policies like expungement and clean slate? So I think something like coming together on do's and don'ts, or pulling together, like if you do get that feedback from organizations about what kind of cannabis knowledge they want their new workforce to have, how can we help you develop the training modules, to put in? What else can we do together, Anthony?
Well, I think, this is happening, right? I think that collectively coming together and having these sides, chats are extremely important. I do also think that as we're developing curriculum, like you said, making sure that, we're doing it collectively. I also think that it's important that we begin to really engage employers around this work collectively, because as we're creating and developing things, is going to be extremely important. I also want to say that we have to figure out how do we incorporate mental health in some of this work, because, it's going to be important, right? And also, how do we differentiate the fact of, recreation and medical, and, are they both the same? Are they are different? I think, you know, um, this is the beginning of a good relationship that can really bond. Because one of the things that I said earlier is that the Educational Opportunity Center, MEOC, is in Manhattan, but we do have stretches across New York City and across New York State that are also kind of trying to figure it out. So if we're able to figure it out here, I think it could be replicated across many of the systems that we are incorporated in. And one last thing that I would say is that how do we also build out our entrepreneurship piece of this? Because that's a component that I haven't mentioned today, or that we haven't mentioned today in detail. But entrepreneurship is also another opportunity for people who are looking to get trained that should be really considering this. But I do think that we're off to a good start with being intentional. I was at some place and they said, if you want change to happen, you have to be intentional about it. So I think that as we do this work, we need to be intentional about it, Danielle, and make it happen. So that would be my add-on.
I absolutely agree. I look forward to more conversations with you about this. I look forward to doing it in places where we can get more feedback from the people who want to be a part of this career pipeline about what they need to learn and the training they need, as well as potential employers and entrepreneurs. And it was a pleasure to speak with you. With that, I'm going to kick it back to Deborah.
It was great. Thank you, Danielle.
So I have a question for the two of you. We still have a few more questions that are rolling in, so I'm gonna beg your time a little longer. We have a question about, as a workforce development program, should they be including cannabis as a part of their training? And if so, what are the different aspects do you think we should be thinking about in workforce development to include in those conversations?
I would say that there needs to be general information that's provided around cannabis, but in particular with individual programs, I think it's important that people know. But I would also say, how does it impact the work that they're about to go into? So if it's something that's going to impact the work that they're about to go into, I do think that it should be embedded into somewhat of the curriculum, in order to make that happen. I do think that the conversation that we had around employer and making sure that we involve the industry, they will help actually leverage and let us know exactly what they're looking for in that space. And, at the same token, the educational institutions have a responsibility to make sure that we educate the employers on what's the trends, right? As Danielle talked about, the research that needs to happen or happens, like what are the trends in specific areas, so that we can be able to educationally identify kind of where those are. But I do think there's opportunities to do kind of a general overview in reference to what cannabis is, but then the entire structure of what we do, but then specifically really identify which programs and which areas that are going to be in more need of it. So when we talk about healthcare, like, is the CNA program a requirement, and should we begin to embed that a little bit more in there, right? Will our EHR, electronic health records component, be a component of how do you take a file and make sure that it has the appropriate documentations, because those are legal and those can get, you know, hospitals and people in trouble if they don't have the legal requirements in order to do EHR the right way. Would a phlebotomist need to kind of have access to what happens if you're dealing with someone, or do you have to provide any injections to someone who's taking something, you know, in the cannabis, right? In the medical cannabis field. So I do think there's opportunities. I do think that we have to be a little bit more intentional about making sure we embed those things into our curriculum. But I also think that the opportunity to speak with more employers around what their needs are is essential to putting it in all of our curriculums.
And I would just add to that, I think that a lot of the workforce development programs also deal with things like, how do you get a job? How do you present yourself at an interview? How do you go through this process? And I think there's a role for talking about cannabis there too, as we were talking about earlier, like being aware of whether there's drug testing involved in the field that you're going to, being aware of what your own use is and how you're going to monitor that, just like you would monitor your alcohol use or your tobacco use or your vaping, or your French fry addiction, as you go through a process and become someone who is showing up at a job every day, and what you talk about or don't talk about, or what you're if you're using cannabis for self-medicating, do you need to move towards a medical cannabis program so you have documentation so that you can properly talk about this with an employer? I think these things may need to become a part of our workforce development training programs as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So Danielle, from that perspective, what's your view or your thoughts about higher education, and where should we be looking to integrate this in both, I guess, our undergraduate and graduate focus? What are your thoughts about that from, I guess, maybe a health policy perspective or an academic perspective? Yeah, I'm going to push just a little.
So I think it is going to be everywhere. You know, when you think about, I'm just thinking about higher ed on the graduate level side. But if you're thinking about higher ed in terms of colleges and undergraduate, cannabis is everywhere from it has to be a part of student life policies, right? Like, you know, when I went to school, they gave us lectures during orientation week about alcohol, and they gave us lectures about consent and sexual activity and different diseases. Like, cannabis should be a part of those conversations now too, because it's going to be a part of college life, in a way that it becomes very different. And I think this is part of why we move towards a regulation. When something is absolutely prohibited, colleges have a way of just saying, oh, it's not going to happen, or just don't, right? I went to a school that didn't have Greek life, which meant all of the sororities and fraternities were off campus and not under the authority of the administration. It didn't mean we didn't have sororities and fraternities, but therefore there were no rules to govern them. Now, and I think that's kind of how cannabis has been. Now that it's legal, and can be present on campuses, there's going to have to be rules, and it's going to have to be a part of student life and health services and the social life. At the same time, it should be a part of the conversations in lecture halls. When you talk about the history of drug use and drug policy enforcement and the criminal justice system and the child welfare system and the inequities in all of these places. You also need to talk about cannabis and how cannabis is different than alcohol and opioids, and what the lessons learned were and experiences in different countries and different cities. So it should be a part of law and sociology and political science and whatever other fields at the undergraduate level get into these, family studies, women's studies. I didn't even touch upon cannabis and pregnancy and the way that women's bodies have been policed differently for drug use, and particularly cannabis use, particularly Black women. So all of this is a part of what should be studied and talked about on an undergraduate level. And then for both undergraduate and graduate, those conversations should continue both in the classroom and in all of these fields that are training people to have jobs as case managers and caseworkers and social workers and social service providers and healthcare providers. You need to know what cannabis is and what the differences are between medical and recreational, and how people may use it and how that may affect both the people you work with and your clients, and what the policies should be there, and how you can collect data on this, and how to collect data in a way that doesn't penalize people. Okay, I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Anthony. You look like you were getting ready to say something.
No, I agree. I think I've been agreeing with you a lot, huh, Danielle? I think that embedding certain things in curriculum and also looking at the allied health arena of the work around cannabis. I think colleges are beginning to look at it a little bit more strategically, but because of, like we talk about, but I also think that it's important that we make sure certain faculty are involved in the process of creating these areas of focus within CUNY and SUNY. I think they kind of drive it somewhat in support of that work. So I think, once again, it's about identifying who's our circle of people that need to be in these conversations that can make it work, and be intentional about, making that happen. So I do think that having it faculty, not all that, but faculty involvement, I think it's going to be essential as we talk about embedding it into programming within even the academic side of the work. So I just wanted to piggyback on what Danielle was saying and just add that piece.
Fabulous. So certificate programs are on the way, for sure. We'll have to think about ways that we incorporate that as we're moving forward. Just want to give the two of you an opportunity. Are there some recommendations that you would like to share with the community? Are there things that as individuals, as organizations, as elected officials, that we should be thinking about in terms of workforce development and next steps? Either recommendations or thoughts. I'll open the floor to you all.
I guess I'll take. Oh, the floor's open to everyone.
No, you, Anthony, yes, the two of you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think that one of the recommendations would be to involve the wider community, meaning, Deborah, you guys have done a fabulous job of making sure that community boards are involved, and but I do think I think we need to look at ways that we should speak to those who are within the communities, right? So who are living in a housing development, who are living in the community spaces that are being impacted by cannabis, but they're being impacted because, like I said before, they see a family member or somebody, a friend who's walking, smoking cannabis in the streets, and they're like, I don't want to smell that. Why do I have to smell that, right? So how do we engage a little bit more these very uncomfortable conversations, and also begin to say, okay, this is what we're doing on this end This is probably not part of what the vision was, right? This is what we're doing. And I think if we're able to communicate, I mean, it's a difficult task, but I think that we need to particularly educate our community, or we're going to be kind of left behind. So I do think community involvement. And as I think about, as we're in this evolution of cannabis, we're also in this evolution of AI and other things, and our communities are always the ones that are kind of lastly supported, right? So how do we get to the ground level? I'm all for policies, but how do we get to the ground level to really, really, one, hear what people are saying, and really, two, understand what we need to do in order to hear what they're saying. I think we sometimes, and I only speak for myself, we do the surface stuff, right? But we really don't get into as my father would say, the nitty gritty, because the nitty gritty makes you uncomfortable sometimes. So.
Thank you.
I
Danielle?
absolutely agree with everything Anthony said. This is why this has been so much fun, right? And I think I would add that community shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. And this probably goes for all the groups you mentioned, Deborah, who we would have recommendations to. Like, don't assume. It's complicated. There's a lot of different pieces to this. And I think that even in creating the MRTA or in moving forward, certain assumptions were made about what people wanted or people would do or what people knew. And I don't think a lot of that is true. I think it in some places, yes, and in other places, no. And so ask questions. Communities have the right to make these decisions, and they should be. And I think the other thing that's a piece of this is not just the economic development that could come from moving into this industry in this pipeline, but also communities have an equal right to say, you know what, we looked at all of this, we thought about it, we don't want it here. We don't actually think a dispensary is good for us right now. And to your point about not being left behind, how do we make sure there still is economic investment in those
Absolutely.
communities as well?
Absolutely.
So that people aren't forced to make choices to get the tax dollars or to get the workforce development programs. How do we use this as an opportunity to move everybody together?
Go ahead, Anthony.
I just was like, I totally agree. And I said, absolutely. And that's all I was going to say. That's all I was going to say.
Totally got you. And I want to thank you. If there are any additional questions from the audience, we'll be happy to take them. But most of all, I think that this conversation's been super helpful. I think it sort of pulls the Band-Aid back about the hard conversations of how we integrate this new cannabis policies and procedures into not only our training programs, but into our programming, and how do we normalize the conversation so that we can really get to be able to assist the community in being able to wrap their arms around this, both positive, negative, whether it's medical cannabis, adult use, but really better understanding the implications and the economic connection that it's going to have to some of the most impacted zip codes in New York State. So with that, I want to say thank you to the two of you. Want to give you an opportunity to have closing statements or closing thoughts before we close out. Anthony, since you are our guest, is there anything you'd like to leave us with, some words of wisdom or pearls that you'd like to drop for us?
I used the term in this being intentional before, and the reason why I use that term is because if we want to see change, we have to make sure that we really prioritize what's important to us. And by being intentional, it allows us to stay focused on what's at hand and the task at hand. I think that, you guys are doing some amazing work to really break through this part. There's a lot of different components to this work and what's being taken on. And, you in order to make change, you have to have people who are willing to step in to support the change. And I think, you guys are off to a really great start. But being intentional about who you bring, what you want to see, how you want to see it, when you want to see it, is extremely important because I always remember that our community sometimes don't look at the timetable, they look at what's happening now. And we have to be careful when we create timetables because the now may be more urgent than the timetable that we're creating. So I'll leave you
Thank
with that.
you. Danielle?
I can't top that. I think I will remind Anthony, because he keeps using this phrase, the work that you're doing, that he's now our partner and in it with us. So it's me. And really, Deborah, I want to thank you and Tamisha and Priya for really carrying this work at the CUNY School of Public Health and creating this series, Breaking Barriers Through Leading with Justice, to create these forums for these all important conversations. And thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Well, thank you both, and thank you to our audience. These series can be found on the School of Public Health and Health Policies Harlem Health Initiative's YouTube channel. For those that are interested, please know that the CPH continuing education credits are available for you by completing the survey. As always, we have a post-survey webinar poll. If you'd be so kind as to complete that for us, you'll see it pop up. And once again, I'd like to thank our partners, Community Board 9, Community Board 10, JUSTÜS Foundation, the Manhattan EOC, as always, and Youth Connect, along with all of our other partners who support us in this work. For us at the School of Public Health and Health Policy, it's not about telling people what to do, but being able to provide science-based information so that we can all make informed decisions, because when you have knowledge, there is power. And we're super excited to be able to look at this from a public health perspective, a workforce perspective. And we look forward to being able to supply spaces and places where it's safe to have these conversations. So we will be launching, as we move forward, additional conversations from our Cannabis Equity Collaborative, and you'll see those coming out shortly. You can also, again, go to our YouTube channel if you're interested in continuing education credits. There are 12 other webinars that are posted that you can apply for credits once you've completed the webinar series. And so we're excited, and thank you again. And on behalf of our Dean, Dr. Ayman El-Mohandes, the team here at the School of Public Health, my trusted team, Ariasela, Priya, Tanisha, thank you all. Here is our social media. Please, please, please follow us. It's the way that you'll know about upcoming webinars that are free. We also have a medical cannabis program that's coming up with the Office of Cannabis Management that we'll be sending out, that will be here live at the school. So come join us. We're on Facebook, Instagram. You can email us. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that we also have our Community Health Equity Bulletin that puts out information from Harlem Strong, our mental health initiative, to our cannabis equity work. So with that, we thank you again. Please feel free to fill out the poll because your opinion is important and it helps us guide the next set of webinars. So thank you very much and have a great day, and we will see you soon.